This is a relay project.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jespersen.
When men buy sex, who really pays? I know that that's going to get your attention right out of the gates, and this episode of Real Talk is one that I guarantee is going to grab your attention from the very beginning and hold it all the way through as we chat with Andrea Heinz, co-author of a new book with that exact title, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? We're going to get into Canadian stories of exploitation, survival, and advocacy. We're going to talk about legislation. We're going to talk about porn. We're going to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We're going to talk about John schools. Do they work? And I think it's important to acknowledge we're going to talk about why you should care. Now, some of you listening to this are going to be ones who've bought sex or who buy sex. Some of you may be listening to this and you sell sex. Some of you may have nothing to do with any of this, and quite frankly, the conversation's making you a little bit uncomfortable. But I guarantee there's elements of what we're going to talk about that are relevant to you, that should matter to you. And I'm excited for you to connect with Andrea Heinz coming up in just a moment. This episode of Real Talk wouldn't be happening without the support of our friends at Danatech, who are speaking to those of you that are in charge of getting your team the industry's best safety training. If that's your wheelhouse, you already know that Danatech's been Alberta's safety training leader for more than 30 years. Their courses are designed by experts with real on-the-job experience, and so they're actually going to make a difference on your job site. You're going to save time lost to injuries. You'll stay compliant with changing regulations. Plus, you'll save money on training with Danatech. Big companies across Canada are using their women's TDG, electrical, lifting device courses for good reason, but their catalog goes way further than that, 150 courses across all industries. If this is right up your alley, you can visit Danatech with a C, that's danatech.com, to see their courses and find out about bulk discounts. Andrea Heinz is an author, a filmmaker, a friend of this show. Her new book, co-authored with Kathy King, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? It's a pleasure to welcome Andrea to the studio. Thanks for making time for us. It's good to have you right here on Real Talk.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be back. And third time's a charm. We're in person together this time.
I like this. You and I have done a couple of interviews before, and I feel like we've found different subject matter every time. And of course, this is a dynamic scenario, isn't it? Where there's calls for changes to legislation, where I hate to call them stories because these involve real people, but stories in the news pop up that put this issue back on our radar, the sex trade, human trafficking in Canada. And can we acknowledge that for some people, it's an uncomfortable conversation? This isn't something that a lot of people talk about over coffee.
Yes, that is absolutely true. It's a very, very complex topic. It has many people involved in the conversation, looking at it from many different angles. And I think that's why we see that it's so polarized, because nobody sees it in one particular fashion. So it's a constant battle, but we're both, I think on both sides, always doing the work, trying to inch our perspective and our position a little bit further along.
Well, I want to invite our audience members that are going to be watching us live on YouTube or listening on the Mixlr live streaming audio app presented by California Closets to jump in that chat and punch in questions and comments, and I know that you're happy to take those questions. For people who aren't familiar with your story, you spent about 7 years in Edmonton's licensed sex industry up until about 13 years ago. You hold a diploma in correctional services. Are you working on that Bachelor of Professional Arts?
Oh, it's the never-ending degree. I've been picking away at that thing for about 10 years.
I don't know how you're doing everything else. You were executive producer on a docu-series about this. Your book's like 400 and some pages. Plus, you got 3 kids at home, you and your husband. So you guys have a busy life. But you're a peer-reviewed scholar, and that's significant. We'll point out why in a bit, on commercial sexual exploitation. And you've appeared as a witness for the Parliamentary Review of Canada's prostitution laws. So this is something that, I guess, on one hand, it's personal for you, but you've also made this your life's work.
It seems to be. Unfortunately, I don't get paid for it.
Yeah.
But, really, that's not where the reward sits. I think the reward sits in seeing the social change and seeing the micro change in the lives of the women who end up involved in the commercial sex industry, as well as the men, too. Because I think we're always talking about the women. How can we help help the women? What can we do about the women? And I think it's time that we start looking as well at the demand side of things. And that's really the impetus for this book that I co-authored with Kathy, was to really shift that paradigm and start saying, we're always talking about choice, we're always talking about labor rights and things like that, but what if we stop and look at it in a different lens, when we start looking at it through a human rights lens, and when we start saying, like, do men deserve better than this industry as well? And I believe that they do. So
my questions are going to jump all over the map, and and we'll just keep it real in that sense. But I've seen sort of two sides presented to Parliament, and I've seen two sides presented to the public, or maybe more than two. One of them is that Canada needs to clamp down on this, and we need to take human trafficking and the sex trade more seriously. And the other hand is, like, this is a free market. These are people operating under their own free will. This should be regulated and taxed like any other industry. And more progressive societies, typically that legalize things like prostitution, tend to have better outcomes. What would you tell the people whose views would align with that?
Well, that's a really, really deep topic again that we could sit and talk about for hours. But I would actually say it's more progressive to look at it through an end demand lens than it is through a market expansion lens. And we're seeing that with a lot of the Nordic countries and things like that, where they're starting to realize that partial decriminalization, where we decriminalize the seller side of the equation and we criminalize the demand side of the equation, is actually what works best for market constriction and shrinking that market. And we know that harm is inherent to prostitution. We can't separate the harm from it. Laws aren't out there raping the women and choking the women and stalking the women, removing condoms on the women. It's unfortunately the men that are doing that, the men that these women end up alone in these rooms with because of their social and economic marginalization. So I think, obviously, I'm on the position that we need to shrink this market, and we need to have a paradigm shift that really starts talking about gender equality. And do we think that women being sold in licensed storefront businesses equates to our progress in any kind of way working towards those goals? And I would argue that it doesn't.
Do you hear from women that are working in the sex trade right now critical of your work?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah?
All the time.
What do they typically say?
Well, before I go there, I'll just say I was one of those women as well, too, right? Whenever I entered the industry at 22 years old, I was $60,000 in debt, and I was coming off of 7 years of a string of very abusive relationships with young men who were not healthy in their own right. And so for me, it was what, survivor Natasha Fowle has even said. She said, if we actually absorbed what was happening to us, and if we acknowledged the truth of it, we couldn't have functioned and done what we had to do for our economic survival in that time, because the reality of prostitution and of being used and discarded by strange man after strange man is so demeaning and so heavy on the spirit, and it really robs you of your soul in many ways. And so, I was the loudest, proudest proponent of full decriminalization. I said, let men buy sex, let people manage these women, which, we know is pimping. Let all these things happen. Make this a market type related thing. Make it a labor issue. Don't make it a human rights thing, because, it is a human rights thing. It's my right to sell sex and to do these things. And I will say, I never want to see a woman criminalized. Nobody does. On any side of the equation, we all share the same goal, which is safety for women, and not wanting to see women criminalized for their marginalization and the choices that they unfortunately have to make because of that. So, again, the battle is there, but we do see a lot of women who have exited prostitution, and even some who are active in prostitution, that say, I don't agree with these market expansion policies. I want to live in a different world where this isn't my only option.
It's like, it rattles me a little bit when we're talking about market expansion policies, when we're talking about the sex trade. And I also want to acknowledge, I want to, be using proper language. And I think that one of the things this show endeavors to do, this audience, is understand the power of language. And just an anecdote, as we're putting this tweet out, sending it from our Real Talk RJ account, saying who's on the show today. And I don't usually ask the guest if they're okay with how I'm introducing them, but with you, so I say author, filmmaker, and former sex worker. And you went, yeah, if you don't mind a tweak, you prefer sex seller to sex worker. Can you explain to us why?
Yeah, so labor language, that is a really, really powerful tool of thought reform, cultural thought reform. And if you look at the work of Robert Lifton, who has done a lot of work around cult ideology, he says one of the tactics used is loading the language. And that's what we're really seeing with the commercial sex industry, is that it's all now sex work. It is the clients, it is the customers, it is the sexual services. It is all these labor language terms that really serve to sanitize what we're actually talking about, and inadvertently make people believe that it is a labor issue first and foremost, right? It immediately puts them into that labor analysis position rather than starting off from a more neutral position to examine the issue or looking at it from a human rights violation as a method of, violence against women. So I think, for me, I always get referred to as a former sex worker, and that's how I used to identify myself. But again, once I had that awakening and I really started reading all the literature and listening to the stories of the other women and starting to, break down that barrier that I had myself that would always be, telling me this is okay, you're choosing this, you're empowered, you're happy, all of that kind of stuff, then I really started to see like how much brainwashing actually rests in this industry to convince women that this is what is best for them. And, it goes beyond the language, obviously. It goes into the money as well, too. Like, this is an industry where we are paying huge amounts of money, hundreds of dollars for unskilled labor, so-called, that requires no previous education, no experience. They want younger people. They want inexperienced people. You're not seeing, the best person for the job, so to speak, getting paid the most, right? As you age, as you are for lack of better terms, a seasoned sex seller, you will make less money, right? So there's a lot of really insidious things that happen in this industry that people don't see because we don't platform that side of it. Like, we just don't hear that narrative. It's not palatable.
The average person probably doesn't have it on their radar, sort of like what do we call it? The sex industry? Are you comfortable with that? The sex industry?
Yeah.
Like, when you look at the sex industry in Edmonton or in Canada, in North America, wherever around the world, aside from the average person driving past, I know they call them body rub parlors. That's always seemed like such a weird phrase to me, but I don't know, it just seems so weird. But, you drive past whatever massage or something, and then everyone kind of goes, oh yeah, we know what's going on there. But the average person, it's not like staring them in the face every single day. How would you assess, and I'm curious to see how you'll answer it, how would you assess the state of the sex industry in Canada today? Like, are there statistics? Are there numbers to know, like how many people are participating, how this is happening, where people are being recruited from, if that's how it goes? Like, what can you tell us?
Yeah, we really don't have enough information. That's really what we know for certain.
Mostly underground, right?
Yeah. Well, I think honestly the underground is somewhat of a myth. And the reason why I say that is I draw on Simon Hagstrom, who is a Swedish police officer. And as you may know, Sweden in 1999 was the first country in the world to take on a Nordic model style legislation, which decriminalizes the selling side and criminalizes the purchasing side. So they've had, many, many decades of working with this model and have seen huge improvements and actually a reduction in their street level exploitation. But something that he said that really, really stuck with me always was, if a man can find a woman to use to exploit sexually, so can a social worker or a police officer. So when we talk about this underground, really what we're talking about is people who are in these really, really dire situations that are in these closed networks where it's friends, kind of like the Jeff Epstein sort of thing, right? Where you would never know as the public anyway that those people are being exploited. But what we do see is that there's a very visible portion of prostitution, and that's happening in our licensing regimes and things like that all across Canada. And actually on page 8 of our book, Kathy King did a wonderful photo, and it's of an iceberg, and it's an analogy that talks about what we see versus what we don't. So, the underground, when we're talking about the underground, that's just more so, in my mind, something that's more ideological of, what are we not understanding about these issues? Because if you look hard enough, you can find it anywhere. You can see all of these things everywhere. But like you said, people, it's just usually not on their radar, which I don't fault them for. Yeah. It's a good thing if it's not on your radar to some degree, right?
Yeah, to some degree, I guess. Yeah. People can check out whenmenbuysex.ca if they want to learn more about the book. Just at first glance, I won't describe the entire graphic that you've talked about on page 8, but it says, here's what's visible, which is adult entertainment, exotic dancers, escorts. So I have to ask you about strip clubs. You say licensed body rub facilities, porn rentals, online stuff. You say semi-visible is like street traffic, independents, private clubs, phone lines, sugar daddies, personal dating ads, survival sex. What's survival sex?
So that's really like hand-to-mouth survival, whenever it's like you're trading sex for a place to sleep, like couch surfing, or immediate needs like a hotel room for that night.
Okay. And then the invisible or the underground pimps, traffickers, commodification, women reduced to objects to be purchased, desperation fueled by poverty and addiction, production of porn, depicting slapping, spitting, brutality, gagging, suffering too painful for people to see, targeting of women and children in poverty-stricken countries. I was blown away. I remember talking to an Edmonton police detective quite some time ago, a number of years ago, talking about how that's if people think that stuff's not happening in Edmonton or in Calgary, they're fooling themselves.
Oh, absolutely. And, we don't know the numbers. Like, people always say, like, how many people buy sex? And unfortunately, we have underreporting all the time with that because people don't want to see themselves as an exploiter or an abuser of women. But Kathy, I really have to give a nod to her because she did some really interesting math. There's been some meta-analysis work done that has concluded that in North America, about 15 to 20% of men are sex purchasers. And so Kathy ran those numbers and she said, what does that mean for Canada? And when we're looking at it in Canada, that, if we're looking at men who are 18 to 75 as sex buyers, and we're taking 15% of our population, that works out to about 2 million sex buyers in Canada, about 500,000 sex buyers in Alberta, and about 84,000 sex buyers just in Edmonton. So when we're looking...
500,000 in Alberta?
Yeah.
You're talking about 500,000 incidents.
Oh no, sorry, 250,000 in Alberta. I had to double check.
But still, there's only 4 million people or 4.5 million people here. That's not an insignificant number.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a huge issue that people just have no clue what's going on. So looking at my numbers again, 400 million buyers globally, and these are conservative numbers too. 2 million Canada, 250,000 Alberta, 84,000 in Edmonton. So when we're talking about the demand and we're trying to separate trafficking from that, we have to remember that, this demand is the root cause of sex trafficking. When men are insisting that there be sex on demand because they have a little bit of money in their pocket, we have to have women who are willing to be in those beds in these brothels to cater to these men sexually. So how do we find this many women who really genuinely choose this industry? They just don't exist. There's not enough of them. So that's why we see trafficking happening. So trafficking is so tied to demand. And people really want to neatly compartmentalize this issue, and they want to separate these things out and say, well, let's just go after trafficking and let's not address the demand. Decriminalize everything, make everything out in the open, bring it out of this, mythical underground, and address trafficking, and that's all that we have to do. But we really have to do more. We have to go to the root of the issue.
I told you that our live chat would come alive in this, and I know you're not afraid of any questions or any comments, so I want to get to this. Ben is wondering, he says, is this topic personal for anybody else? He says, our parents' friends had one of their daughters forced to go work. He has it in quotes in Vancouver. He says, so I actually met like a pimp or recruiter when I was like 10 years old. That from Ben. Travis issues the caveat and says, I'm not trying to be a dick. Okay, so he says, I'm not trying to be a dick. He says, but Andrea talks about being used, but respectfully, was she also not, was the other party not, was she not the other party engaged in the transaction? Like, did she not have agency or other options? He says, just a legitimate question. I'm not sure if this was like a pimp situation where she was being controlled in other ways. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's the criticism I get all the time, right? Is saying nobody had a gun to your head. Nobody forced you to do this. You weren't third party exploited by a pimp or a trafficker. But again, I was 3 key things. I was immature. I was impoverished, $60,000 in debt at 22 years old, and I was impressionable. So I was very, very prone to falling privy to, that sex work ideology narrative that tells you what you see in Pretty Woman, with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, telling you, hey, this is great, this is going to be wonderful. And it really serves to silence the inherent violence and the harm that happens to that. So, of course, when we look at choices and decisions, they're 2 different things. So yes, I made the so-called choice to go into the industry, but I was, about to lose my housing. I had no food in my fridge. I had no gas in my car. I had no financial literacy. I was working 5 part-time jobs for 2 hours straight, averaging 96 hours a week, and I still couldn't clean that debt. I couldn't clear it out. So, at what point then was I really choosing, or was I actually just deciding to do something because I had a lack of really equally viable choices available to me?
Are there how women that and I'm saying women, I mean, I guess it's not exclusively, but it seems predominantly women that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
How are they typically recruited? Like, I mean, are there people that are coming from relatively stable upbringings but have like hit a rough patch financially or otherwise? Like, can you give us some insight into how it all works?
Yeah, well, there's many pathways in, but very few out, right? So we never really have this like classic story of what brings women into prostitution. I've met women who have ended up in the industry for all types of reasons, right? Trying to pay off post-secondary education. They'd been children in care. They were sexual abuse victims. They were, just single moms. They were widows. They were everything that you can imagine, every demographic. So we really can't, similarly to buyers, pigeonhole people into these boxes as to this is who a seller is, this is who a buyer is.
That's my next question for you.
Yeah.
Who are the buyers?
Yeah.
Who's buying sex?
Everybody. Unfortunately, it's all types of men. It really is. But, I want to go back and say it's not the majority of men, right? Like, and I think whenever we criticize these systems, we're seen as criticizing men. And that's not the case, but we're criticizing a culture that has, really moved men into this position of feeling sexual entitlement through purchasing power. So it's, market-oriented policies really that are making it so that women and children are paying the cost of these ideologies, right? That really serve to make other people money. But, I've been involved in the Edmonton John School now for 11 years, and I've met hundreds and hundreds of men who have been arrested for purchasing sex. And it's an alternative measures program, so they don't end up with a charge at the end if they complete the program. And they're all
that
types
would be
of
a
men.
huge motivating factor.
Oh, yeah.
That's not the one you want on your record.
No, definitely not.
You don't want a record, but
Yeah.
you especially don't want that record.
Well, and that's the thing, too. We don't want to see men arrested. We want men to stop purchasing sex and stop using resources and money to coerce women into feigned yeses to sexual consent on their own accord. We don't want to have to arrest them, because that is a traumatizing experience and nobody should be subjected to that. But men themselves, in many research studies, have said the only thing that really will make me stop is the fear of getting arrested. So, we arrest them, we put them through this program, and it's very, very intense education, 8-hour program where they hear from former sex buyers, former sex sellers, Kathy King, mother of one of Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women, people who are dealing with sex addiction, community members who are just impacted living in high traffic areas of prostitution. And these men change. They really do. We have about a 1 to 3% recidivism rate. That
1 to 3%?
Yeah, very effective.
In other words,
program.
1 to 3% reoffend.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Well, get rearrested. We don't know if they're out there reoffending.
Fair.
We hope that they aren't. That's on them if they do after that information. But they can't say that they don't know any better about, the ties between exploitation and trafficking at that point after.
You bring up missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and obviously your co-author, Kathy King, has just like walked miles in shoes that people can't imagine and has experienced that pain that other people can't imagine, that haven't lost a loved one under a horrific circumstance like that. I don't want to come across like I'm the advocate for legalizing this all, but I have in conversation about this in particular about women like the Picton victims, and I know that RCMP believe that there's something going on in Alberta, and we don't have all the information. I don't know if you have insight on that as well, but there could be a serial killer at work. And this is a weird way for me to put it. And people have said, these women, these victims, these women that were essentially either duped or kidnapped or whatever and ultimately murdered, had they been in a facility, had they been in a place where this was all, you've heard this before, had they been in a place where this was overseen and regulated and taxed, that they'd be more safe. And if they were going to do this, they'd be more safe than being out on the street with literal predators, basically prowling and ultimately murdering people. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, that's a big myth, I think, is the indoor safety myth, as we call it. So, it's this belief that somehow a brick and mortar building somehow stops violent men from being violent, right? And, I've been choked in city licensed massage parlors, body rub centers as we call them, to the point of near unconsciousness. I've been stalked. I've been followed home where men have been banging on my door at 2:00 in the morning. I'm scared to, walk my dog, take my trash out. They're leaving love notes in there in my mailbox. They're, circling in my neighborhood. They're circling around the brothel because, hey, go on the website and you can find me. I'm there 4 days a week, 5 days a week. Here's my times that I'm there. So they'd be sitting, they'd be watching us. Like, there's a very big fear of obsession that comes with a lot of these sex buyers too, because you're selling them a fantasy. You're telling them, hey, you're the best, person I've had sex with. You're so satisfying. And you're saying all these things because you really want to make that man orgasm as fast as possible to get him out of your body and out of your vicinity. But, men, whenever they're hurting and they're not healed men, healthy men, they're hearing this messaging and then they're like, oh, okay, she does believe these things. And, it's tied to an orgasm. So that dopamine release and all of these things. So they really start to get to that point of obsession. And it's very scary. And, when we look at people arguing harm reduction, particularly around legislative responses, we have to look at, what has actually happened since we've had our partial decrim model since 2014, our Nordic model law, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And they did some research, I think it was 5 years prior to when the model came into effect. And in that time, we had 54 women murdered in prostitution, 20 of which were indigenous women. When they examined 5 years after we brought in this Nordic model legislation, that number of murdered victims went from 54 to 35. And the number of indigenous women murdered went from 20 to 7. So, still, unfortunately, we're still seeing, on average, about 7 women killed per year in Canada that are involved in prostitution, which is horrific. But how does moving them indoors change that, right? Predators will find them wherever they are. And they found us in the brothels. I know tons of women that are in therapy right now, for PTSD, that are still, like myself, battling severe dissociation and recurring waves of suicide ideation from just that feeling of being used and discarded one after another, and that's your daily existence in this brothel room where, a strange man who you have no idea who he is, you're not getting any ID, anything like that. Our city just, protects buyer anonymity like many other jurisdictions. And we just have no judicial recourse to even go after these men if they do something horrible to us. So, we're really
let me ask you, so hypothetically or not hypothetically, like when you're, I don't want to sort of like go back to a specific circumstance involving you unless you want to talk about it, but hypothetically, if a woman selling sex is choked or assaulted in even a licensed place, what's the likelihood that there'd be a police complaint filed? Is it zero?
Well, of course, owners don't want police presence at their facilities,
Obviously,
right? Yeah, that's bad for business. And of course, anytime that a police officer would come just to check on us and do any of that type of work, men would not come in, right? So
would that happen though? Police would visit?
Yeah, they would. They would partner with the City of Edmonton bylaw information officers, and they would come in and just basically make sure that we weren't, underage and that we weren't trafficked. But, I sold sex alongside trafficked women. I sold sex alongside minors that, duped the system and took their sister's ID to the city. And I didn't know at the time, obviously, I would have reported it, but, sold sex alongside a 16-year-old girl in our city brothels for 3-4 months before it was detected. So how many men came and essentially, raped a minor and paid to do that and didn't know, right? So like all these, safeguarding things, they really don't work whenever we're starting to actually look at the logistics of it.
Andrea Heinz is our guest. I'm grateful you're here. I want to, when we come back, her book, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? You can check out the website, whenmenbuysex.ca, if you want to learn more about upcoming events, if you want to get your hands on the book, read some reviews, learn more about the authors, both Andrea and Kathy King. When we come back, I want to ask you, it may not be everybody buying sex or participating in the sex trade, but I bet a whole hell of a lot more watch porn. And I want to talk to you about porn coming up in just a second. Plus, we'll get to our live chat on YouTube on this special edition of Real Talk, which is made possible with the support of sponsors like our friends at California Closets, who want to remind you that you're now into March in 2024. You've promised yourself this was going to be the year you were going to get organized, you were going to get decluttered, and it's okay to acknowledge that you could use a little help. It all starts with a free design consultation. Their designers, top shelf. You won't believe how they can hide Murphy beds or get those ironing boards to fold away and out of sight. What they could do with your home office, have it double as a guest room, get those printers and charging cords out of the way. And don't even get me started on what they can do with garages. Nobody does garages better than California Closets. The consultation's always free at californiaclosets.ca. If you're a professional engineer, this message is for you. You could be in Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC. Heck, you could be keen on living and working in the Lone Star state of Texas. Apex Automation is doing a ton of work, in particular in the energy industry. They also work in shipping, automating port traffic. They work in AI, all kinds of super cool stuff. Industry 4.0 is their jam, and they're hiring right now. They got more work than they can handle, which is a great opportunity for people looking to maximize their career and personal potential. Apex puts its people ahead of profits. You can learn more about their corporate culture by checking out the careers link at apexautomation.ca. If you're in charge of picking up the food for your beloved dogs and cats, if you're the buyer in your household, you're going to want to take a second and check out Grand Dog Essentials quality raw food online at granddog.ca. They're working now with CK9, which is a raw pet food manufacturer. They work on human-grade facilities right here in the province of Alberta. All of the protein is grown locally, and they've got some really neat, unconventional stuff like duck and boar and kangaroo. What? If you want to learn why your dog or cat might benefit from kangaroo or duck, you can check out their blog link or the Shop Now link, where you'll find more information on all their products, including the supplements like we've used for our pups, Moses and Monroe. We've seen the health benefits Grand Dog Essentials delivering to your door in Calgary, Edmonton, and Central Alberta. And before we get back to Andrea Heinz, I want to put this on your radar. We hope that you never have to get in touch with Complete Care Restoration, but heaven forbid this spring or summer a sewer backup happens, or a pipe bursts, or there's spring runoff, which causes flooding in your place. We know that wildfires are going to be brutal this year. This is a team that for more than a quarter century has been restoring property and rebuilding peace of mind. Complete Care Restoration has a team of talented and certified professionals. That's a big deal. Ready to respond 24/7. If disaster strikes, you can contact them 24 hours a day at completecarerestoration.ca. Andrea Heinz, our guest in studio. Now, this is real talk, to be sure. She's got a relatively new book out, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? She's doing a ton of work with the Edmonton Sex Trade Offender Program, that's STOP, known as John's School, as well as Cease Trafficking, the Center to Empower All Survivors of Exploitation and Trafficking. Don't think I didn't notice that Cease changed their name.
I was just going to say, I'm very impressed that you caught that, because that was only released, I think, yesterday or the day before.
No, I caught it as I'm reading it live on the show, because it used to be the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, wasn't it?
Yes.
And now it's the Center to Empower Survivors of Exploitation and Trafficking. I love that.
Yes, that was actually a name gifted to the organization by indigenous activist April Eve Weiberg, who's the founder of the Stolen Sisters and Brothers Action Movement here in Edmonton, and is also a survivor herself of trafficking and of commercial sexual exploitation.
Neat.
So.
It reminds me of what Yes did as well. It used to be the Youth Emergency Shelter Society. Now it's the Youth Empowerment Society, which I think is, I love that. People are invoking that word empowerment.
Yes.
A lot of people watch porn, whether they admit it or not. A lot of people talk about it openly. Other people, it's their quiet habit. Pornhub is, we know, one of the most popular websites. It's top 5 traffic website in the world.
Yes, trafficking hub.
A trafficking hub, yeah, sure. But I mean, that includes Google. And I mean, like this is a site that a lot of people use. Let's talk about porn.
Yeah, well, I will give a disclosure that I'm not a porn expert. I never was in the porn industry, or porn sublet of the sex industry. But yeah, it really is a lot of marketing that works to serve to create this normative effect of, women being subservient and sexually subordinates, of men. So I think it's very problematic. It's propaganda, really, in my opinion. And you look at, you mentioned Pornhub. Like, have you followed any of the Trafficking Hub campaign?
I can't say I have. Tell me about it.
Okay, so yeah, MindGeek, ALO, now Ethical Capital Partners, which is kind of a funny name, they really are a criminal entity. They have been streaming and profiting off of child sexual abuse videos for many, many years. Anyone could film any type of video and upload it to Pornhub's website. And there was also a download button for many, many years, which people could then save these files of videos. And I know multiple women who were minors, who were drugged, who were raped. Their rape videos ended up on that website. They were, of course, then, like I said, monetized by Pornhub. Also by the people who are posting them, so making traffickers and exploiters wealthy. And they ended up I can't remember the exact again, I haven't followed it all super closely, but Arnold Viersen, member of parliament for Westlock Barrhead, he's been a really strong advocate going after this digital realm of exploitation. And I think it was 1985 was until Arnold Viersen's motion a few years ago. 1985 was the last time that we reviewed the issue of pornography in Canada. So it had been, I think, something like 30 years before we revisited that issue. But, MindGeek had to end up scrubbing 80% of their videos.
80%?
80%. Millions of videos, because they couldn't verify the age or consent of the people in the video. And now we're seeing that Pornhub is in, I think it's now 6 American states. They have removed their platform. They're not streaming to those states because those states are saying, we want you to, develop some type of system where those who are logging onto your website have to verify their age.
Pierre Poilievre's talking about this.
Yeah, huge issue, So again, it's not my area of expertise. Mine is more so, combating sex work ideology and addressing demand. But, I have a lot of respect for a lot of people who are doing very important work, because porn is really, I think, a bigger issue than sex buying in many ways, right? And it's a gateway for a lot of men into buying sex. At the John School, we hear from men all the time who have been arrested for purchasing sex, and they say, porn brought me here. It was really like, an obsession with that, because again, that dopamine hit. And there's a really good movie too. It's, what is it called? I think it's called Don Juan. You may have seen it. It's got the Third Rock from the Sun guy. Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's really neat. Like, highly recommend watching this movie if people haven't seen it. And so he goes on, to, I don't know if it's Pornhub or some website, but it makes this little like doo-doo-doo when he logs into the porn site, and it almost has like this Pavlovian effect on him, where he gets into like the porn brain. And and later on in the movie, he's dating like Scarlett Johansson, which obviously, stunningly beautiful woman. He can't sexually perform, do any of these types of things, because he has to be watching porn to get an erection and to get arousal. So porn really does have a lot of problems, I think, as well, too, beyond the social ramifications, just when it comes to, bodily functions and how people are, living in their own lives.
Yeah. Don John.
Thank you.
Yeah, Don John. I haven't, it's from 2013.
Oh, yeah.
Pronounced Don Juan, though.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's a great movie. It's a great movie, yeah.
Don Juan?
Yeah.
D-O-J-O-N? Okay. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
I'll go watch it.
Yeah.
He's a great actor.
He is.
He really is. Interesting story. Yeah, you'd be curious to know. I mean, obviously marriage counselors aren't going to be spilling the beans about what their clients are talking to them about, but I'd be curious to know what percentage of marriages that are sort of like, the sex life is either unhealthy or non-existent. What percentage of those porn would factor in,
Yeah. Well, and they've shown too, like studies, there's extensive studies about porn that have shown that it really does rewire the brain, and it makes it so that people excuse violence against women a lot more than they would if they weren't a porn consumer. And they also are, I think, more excusatory of like child exploitation or something. Again, I don't have all the stats, but some pretty alarming things where it serves to desensitize people to issues of violence against women, because I think around like 80 or 90% of porn nowadays it entails violence against women. There's a lot of choking, slapping, biting, hair pulling beyond a little bit of aggressive sex, I guess you could call it. It's actually like filmed sexual violence rather than filmed sexual encounters. So, yeah, really problematic. And I think, if people want to stop buying sex, particularly, the first place to start is to stop consuming pornography.
Yeah. Would you like to see strip clubs shut down? Do you have a problem with strip clubs?
I mean, I have any context where somebody's sexuality is commercialized, I think is a slippery slope, right? That's when we start, like, I loved whenever you did the ad break there, and the second ad said, people over profits, because that's really what we have to start looking into as well, is prioritizing people over profits. And we look at the female body, and it's exploited in many ways. Commercial surrogacy is another one of those ways too, right? Can't have a child? Well, find an impoverished woman in America that you can pay tens of thousands of dollars to, and she'll risk her life, and she will have all these complications and things like that. But you can buy a body for whatever usage you want. So it really crosses.
So
in a lot
you don't
of ways.
support that?
No, definitely
really?
not. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know someone who did that, and well, I don't speak for her, obviously, But I think for her, it was a great opportunity.
But was it commercialized, right? Because in Canada, commercial surrogacy is illegal. Donating your blood is illegal. Donating your sperm or eggs is illegal, right? But
You mean, was she paid for it?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure.
probably not in Canada then, right? Other countries will do that, but Canada has actually taken a really good stance on a lot of these issues.
So you mean if someone is a surrogate for another couple or for someone and carries their baby and then receives a cash payment for it, that's illegal?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can be compensated for any outstanding costs. So like if you have, say, additional medical fees or something like that, those can be paid. But you cannot be paid basically a fee for your service of carrying that child for somebody, because we know, again, that it will be the impoverished, the most marginalized that will put themselves in these risky situations to cater to people who have money and don't want to put themselves in those situations in many cases, right?
People are bringing up OnlyFans in the chat. For people that aren't familiar, I think most people are, but OnlyFans is a site where somebody can set up an account and then subscribers contribute an amount every month, and then they get access typically to nudes or videos or what have you. And you know, obviously you're going to roll your eyes when I bring up the money, but like you hear these stories of women that are like, you know, I don't want to say nobodies, but what I mean is like nobody's heard of them before. They're not celebrities. They're not movie stars. And they're making like 6 figures monthly on OnlyFans. You know, I mean, some of the comments here, people are saying like about OnlyFans, or whatever, it bumped up. The live chat's going nuts right now, which is fantastic. But again, like OnlyFans, so that's like, you know, I'm going to imagine it's something that you're not supportive of,
Yeah.
but at the same time, people are going to say, well, hang on a second, though. That's an opportunity for somebody to start an account and make $100,000 a month in theory. You know, why should we stand in the way of that if it's their own free will and choice?
Yeah, well, the key word that you said is in theory, right? Beware of the propaganda, right? Because all of these platforms exist to make money off of women, essentially, right? They want to cut. So OnlyFans takes a 20% cut off of all profits of any, you know, performer, I guess you could say, on those websites. And OnlyFans, they actually started out really good. They were a website that happened to come about to support like bands and, you know, artists and things like that. And then it very quickly got swallowed up by the sex industry.
Yeah.
And people think, well, this is a woman, you know, doing this autonomously. Like there's no pimp in these situations. She's posting these photos. She's doing this. We don't know that. We never know the background story of the women who are being commercially sold for any type of sex, right? Porn, prostitution, any of that kind of stuff. Because if I am in the industry, am I going to say, hey, Ryan, you know, thanks for coming and bringing me your money. I really need it because I'm really struggling. But, you know, when we have sex, like my skin crawls and I have to swallow my own vomit at times because I'm so disgusted and I'm dissociating and I'm doing all these things because it's very traumatic and it reminds me of being abused as a child when that happened to me. Would you stay and pay for sex? I like to believe that most men wouldn't, right? That most men are good men and that they are falling privy to this narrative, this social narrative of empowerment and all these things. And, oh, but this is okay. This is trafficking. This is exploitation. But this over here, OnlyFans, you know, it's different. And what we're seeing too is that like these are very tokenized stories. And a lot of times I actually wonder if they're even genuinely true. Because when you look at the average earnings of the typical woman on OnlyFans, they're actually making less than minimum wage. They're putting in tons of hours on these websites. They're buying outfits. They're doing, you know, all of this content. And most of them are making less than 150 US a month for doing this full time. So it's not actually a profitable side gig. But, you know, we saw an explosion of OnlyFans over COVID there.
Huge.
And, you know, why is that? Is it all of a sudden just because during COVID, women just thought, hey, I really want to be a so-called sex worker? Or was it that women were driven to such poverty that was what sucked them in at the time, right? We just saw that. But we didn't see men decreasing really the amount of sex and sexual exploitation that they were doing on their end, right? They still had money to spend on these things, but women were losing their part-time jobs, their casual jobs. Those were all the jobs that were being cut first and foremost. And so women really, you know, flooded into the commercial sex industry because there you're being offered hundreds of dollars an hour for in-person prostitution. You know, that's going to beat your job at McDonald's, right? So again, that money has so much power over us and how we think that all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, I'm empowered. Look at all this money I'm making. But when you take that money away, if you actually paid what it was actually worth as an unskilled so-called job that anybody can do with no training or experience, you'd be getting minimum wage. And how many women would continue to be in prostitution if that was what they were earning?
It's Alberta Ginger that said, I feel like OnlyFans could be much better, but it says you're working for yourself rather than someone else. You kind of touched on that already. This is interesting from Seventh Pilot, who says if you have daughters, you're always worried about other men, but educating your daughters on what to watch out for is important. Is this? I mean, yeah, it's always interesting conversations that follow along gender lines, but this one seems to kind of fit if you just look at the statistics. It's same as conversation about domestic violence. There's always going to be an exception, but the majority of survivors of domestic violence are women and children. Do you have a message to the young girls? Do you have a message to like the 11 to 15-year-olds?
You deserve better than a life of being commoditized. And, I know people say, well, in all areas of life, we're all commoditized, right? We all live under capitalism. But I think the difference in prostitution is that you are the product. You are what is being sold. The body is the product. So when you are reduced down to your body, and that's where your so-called value rests, it's very, very hard to, love yourself in many other ways, right? Your body starts to age, it starts to deteriorate or whatever. And that then ties into your feelings of self-worth too. So we do see a lot of women who, enter the industry and they're very confident. And I actually had a City of Edmonton bylaw officer say this to me once. He said, when the women come into the course that they have to take, this mandatory 3-hour course prior to getting a license, he said they're all like young and bright-eyed and cheery and happy. He said, I see them about 2-3 months later on the couch in the brothel staff room, and it's like I'm looking at a skeleton. He said it's just like a zombie sitting there, like all the life has already been sucked out of her. Like these Johns are energy vampires that are, using this money, taking these women into these rooms in private areas where nobody's seeing what's happening. Nobody's actually there to protect her when she's alone in that room with that man who is sexually charged and sexually entitled. And he said they're a dead version of themselves. And so, a couple years ago, I did an art installment where I took skeletons and I put lingerie and wigs on them. And I took one to the City of Edmonton, I took one to the Canada Place building, and I took one to the Alberta Legislature grounds. And I put, signs of like the sex acts that are asked upon these women, what they're asked to do by these strange men. And a lot of it is unprotected sex, a lot of danger, a lot of risk. Where they're asking women to swallow ejaculate, where they're, asking women to have sexual intercourse without condoms. Women are, desperate for the money. And we're seeing this slippery slope of where these things didn't used to happen. When I was in the industry, you didn't even kiss a sex buyer. You never gave a blowjob without a condom. Now that is almost unheard of. And if you are one of those people, you're very, very unlikely to be making any money. Now what we're seeing is this explosion of girlfriend experience, or GFE, which is, again, kissing, intimacy. So it's not even just the physical act, but now it's the emotional. You have to, give yourself and your spirit to this person, not just your body. And then that went by the wayside, and now we're in PSE, which is porn star experience. And that basically is, what we were talking about with porn, anything goes. You can find any video of anything, and now as long as you have about $400, you can go into a City of Edmonton brothel. You can request that a woman has bareback sex with you, and these women are taking antiviral, anti-HIV medication after the fact, just to avoid any personal risk to some degree, and obviously of a physical nature. And just doing that for the money, right? Because that's the only way that they can make money, some of these women. So when do we stop and kind of say enough is enough? We want more for women. Women deserve better.
How did you wind up here? Can we talk about your road out to a position now? I mean, I've referenced your film a couple of times, the docuseries Labeled, which you guys did an unbelievable job with that. People can Google it or find it online. You've got your new book out. You're a facilitator and an administrator. You're overseeing this John School. I mean, you're just doing a ton of work here, and people would look and say, you're testifying in front of parliamentary committees, and people would say, she kind of got it all together, got it all figured out. You course corrected in a big way. And now, looking to change other people's life and save people from some of the negative experiences you had, and ultimately, in some cases, save people's lives. How did that happen?
I think just a love for people, honestly. I think people always want to say that if you're against prostitution, you're against women, you're against men, you hate sex. I don't hate any of those things. I love men. I really respect men. I think that they are, defenders of women and protectors of women. And I think, obviously women are amazing and much more capable than we allow them opportunities to show themselves as. So I think for me, it was just seeing the injustice and again, I was, the loudest, proudest defender of full decrim, and I really felt duped whenever I left the industry and I started actually seeing the bigger picture. I thought, this is a huge injustice. This is like one of the biggest human rights violation that exists. And how do people not know this? And, ignorance, right? It's just not the narrative that is platformed because it's not palatable and it doesn't make money. So I think, it was just wanting people to have the information. And of course, some people are still going to judge me or say things or conclude that I, am doing this for all the wrong reasons or whatever. But it's really, just that I want people to have the information and I want a better world for both men and women.
What are the reasons that people accuse you of doing, the root of your advocacy?
Oh, just saying like that I want attention. And I'm like, trust me, if I wanted attention, it would not be for this. Okay. Like you don't get good attention coming out and saying that you spent 7 years in the sex industry and you've sold your body over 4,300 times to strangers. There's no respect in that, right? People don't look at you and give you respect for that. So, they're saying, oh, you're just trying to, deal with what you went through so that you're reframing it in your mind so that you're not a victim so that you see yourself as a victim rather than an active agent, in your own harm and just things like that, right? Like they're trying to, again, work off of that compartmentalization, right? This is this is that. They can't see that bigger picture. So criticism comes with it, and I'd be getting criticism if I was, a proponent of sex work ideology. If I was coming on here saying the opposite, I'd be getting criticized.
Oh, sure.
So no matter what you do, someone's going to complain.
Yeah, one thing we found that holds true is you'll get criticized no matter what position you take on anything. So you might as well take a position that you can believe in and feel strongly about.
Mm-hmm.
When we come back from this quick break, are you cool to talk some politics? I'm curious to know like where you'd like to see legislation in Canada go and what you think ideologically is standing in the way, why there's no progress there, maybe some of the more contentious asks, and ultimately to this audience a call to action.
Yeah.
With Andrea Heinz, the co-author, along with Kathy King, of When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays. You can find more information on the book in the show notes. This conversation is made possible with the support of Real Talk partners like our friends at Friesen Brothers, who want to essentially get you off the hook of doing all this work when it comes to your Easter dinner. If you're going to be having family or friends over at your place and you'd rather hang out with them and spend quality time as opposed to sit in the kitchen the entire time, getting those yams exactly how they need to be or making sure that the ham's not overdone, all you need to do is go to cateringbyfriesen.com/Easter dinner. You can customize it. It starts with the traditional gammon ham, roasted pineapple glaze, unreal, roasted garlic parmesan baby potatoes, honey dill carrots, which in my mind, I've told Johnny a million times, I think is the best thing that Friesen Brothers sells, plus add-ons like Granny's stuffing, BLT potato salad, and of course their iconic sourdough hot cross buns. You can learn more by checking out cateringbyfriesen.com/Easter dinner or just go visit them in store. And a big shout out to their Glenora location, West Edmonton Friesen Brothers, opening officially on April 12th. Another exciting note from a Real Talk sponsor that's hiring right now, that's Kubi Renewable Energy, solar energy solutions to power your life. They're a full-service contractor for residential and commercial solar power systems. Johnny right now showing us on screen, this is that South Edmonton Fire Hall. It's the first net zero fire hall in Canada. How cool is that? Did an absolutely beautiful job with that installation. They can do the same on your home, your cabin, your cottage, your barn. And if you're an installer, an electrician, an apprentice, maybe an HR professional, sales professional, office manager, they're hiring all those roles. Check out the careers link at kubienergy.ca. And for those of you that are making big plans this summer to host an anniversary or graduation, maybe a birthday party, a retirement gathering in your front or backyard, and you want it to look as best as it can. You want it to look better than any other yard on the block. Eden Landscaping is your go-to. It's a no-brainer. They've been bringing outdoor spaces to life for more than 20 years. A custom landscape builder with experience in everything you're going to need. Retaining walls, excavation. They can run natural gas lines out to your garage. They can get in that backyard pond you've always wanted. What about an outdoor kitchen? What about a pergola where you can gather with family and friends? They're great listeners. They've got a fabulous philosophy on landscape design, and they'd love to work with you. You can find Eden Landscaping online at landscapeedmonton.ca. Andrea Heinz, our guest, co-author of When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? So you've obviously spoken in front of elected officials before. You do a lot of work with them. You've noted some local members of parliament. What would you like to see happen ultimately? Like, let's get specific on a couple of fronts. And what do you think stands in the way? What are the biggest objections from politicians in your experience? And why do you think that is?
Well, I think the law that we've had since 2014, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, this partial decrim model that we spoke of already, I think it's the right model. And I think, Canada is best served in keeping that model, but we need to strengthen it. So we have not seen really strong endorsement of the model from any politicians, aside from, a very small handful. And we haven't seen any strong enforcement universally of this model either. So there's only very small pockets within Canada that are actually doing any in-demand work. I think that, that model is important. It's the best one that we could have when we're looking at other ones like, full decriminalization, legalization, or like what America has, which is full criminalization, which nobody wants. But there is one section in PSEPA, the federal law that we have now, that I would like to see removed, and that's Section 213. And what that section does is it still affords an opportunity for a sex seller to be criminalized if they are found to be soliciting themselves outside of a church or a school or a daycare or anywhere that kids can be present. It's a very vague law. It doesn't give any, meter like distancing to any of these places or anything like that. And of course, again, it still, leaves a window for our very most marginalized sex sellers who are still operating on the streets to face some form of criminalization. So I would like to see that scrubbed. We do see that, unfortunately, the conservatives, I think, like that part being in the model because it protects the community in their view, which, is a warranted claim. Because, you don't want your children going to daycare and seeing somebody, soliciting themselves and men circling around and making that area dangerous for children and women. So that's kind of the hot topic of that legislation. But I think we do have the right model. What I would like to see is more financial investment in the model, because part of Nordic model mindset essentially is, having to invest money into exit opportunities and programs that serve to, assist the women who are in prostitution, because we know that most women are there because of economic need and economic destitution. So if we're not doing anything on the other end to, create specific programs for them, really, we're just not doing anything to help, right? We're removing them out of the industry, but then inevitably they probably will end up back in there. So I think that we need more of that. And we also need our politicians to recognize the link between purchasing sex, just the commercial sex industry, and human trafficking. Because again, we keep going back to that compartmentalization. Let's address trafficking. Let's just arrest the traffickers. Let's strengthen Canada's human trafficking laws. And let's just fully, open up the floodgates for a sex industry. And when we had our law first coming in, again, around 2014, prior to it coming in, we saw Dennis Hoff, who is, a pimp, a brothel owner from the States, who ran the Chicken Ranch and all those Nevada brothels. He had about 4 or 5 of them. He was talking about coming into Canada and setting up mega brothels in Montreal and Toronto and Vancouver. He said, Canada's got a problem, I've got the solution. And so here we are at risk of being a sex tourist country. And we share, 9,000 kilometers of border with America, who has twice the adult male population that we have of our entire population in Canada. So, we don't want to become like Germany. When we go this market expansion route of legalization or full decrim, we're going to see people coming here from fully criminalized Canada, bringing their women up here to sell them in our brothels. They're going to be doing sex tourism trips coming up here. And again, how do we find women to fill those beds? It's going to come back to somebody trafficking them. So, we have to really address end demand. We have to. And it makes a better, return on investment to go after the buyers than it does to go after a trafficker.
What do you mean?
Okay, so I had to write notes for this because this is a pretty complex thing. I wanted to make sure I got it right. But just earlier this month, I was in Winnipeg for a prosecuting demand conference that brought together a ton of law enforcement officers, politicians, people who are working, as advocates in this field. And there was a police officer there from Longueuil Police Service outside of Montreal. His name is Ghislain Verrier. And he did this presentation. I was scribbling notes frantically because I was just so taken aback by this. And he said, okay, so people want to go after traffickers, right? That's always the thing. Arrest the traffickers. And he said, just to get, a trafficker to the point of conviction, just that alone ranges between $100,000 and $200,000. just in, police resources. So the breakdown of this is on one victim, by the way, so not multiple victims, which is usually very, the situation with a lot of these trafficking cases. But so section 279.01, trafficking persons, you have one trafficker exploiting one victim. And he said it's going to take about $5,000 to $8,000 just to crack the phone, right? Because traffickers aren't giving the passwords of their phones to police. So they have to crack the pimp's phone, the trafficker, and also the victim's phone typically to get all the data and information. So that's $5,000 to $8,000 per phone. Then you need 200 to 300 hours of work per detective, and you need on average 4 detectives to do this work because they're always working in teams, right? If you go to interview a victim, you've got 2 detectives. Then you've got the salaries of the judge, the crown, judicial staff. Then if you do get a conviction, which we only have about a 12% conviction rate of
12%?
Of trafficking, right? It's a very, very hard crime to detect. It's very hard to apprehend traffickers, and it's very, very hard to prosecute them. So we have a very low conviction rate, 12%. And he said, so, you spend $100,000 to $200,000 just to, get through the investigation and get this guy to the point of a conviction. Then you're going to be paying $120,000 a year to house this trafficker for about, 2 to 4 years in a federal institution. So, when you're looking at it, that's over $500,000 for just one victim, right? And that's late stage exploitation. This is where someone's just coming in and saying, oh, there's a demand to meet, and I'm going to help meet that demand by trafficking these women. So if you look at going after the buyers who are the root cause of why this all happens, it's $500 per buyer to get them. So, over $500,000 for one trafficker, which doesn't change the climate, is very reactive. The culture remains intact. Or you spend $500 per sex buyer, and all that the police have to do is run an ad, a decoy ad, and rent a hotel room. And then it's just the basic police salaries that they would be, spending.
And then what? The assumption is that as demand drops, then traffickers will just walk away from the business because it's not a viable model anymore. But then this is what brings up that cliche, which is probably true, that prostitution or selling sex is the oldest profession in the world. Mm-hmm. And people say it's never going to go away. People are driven by lust. People are horny. People want to dominate other people. People want to be able to buy something that they maybe can't attain without buying. Or I can't get into the psyche of that, but I bet there's a million reasons why people buy sex. Yeah. That's probably a few of them. And those don't just magically go away. Those are probably the last things to go away with a lot of people, right?
Yeah, it's a hard battle, right? We're facing an uphill battle, and really it requires a paradigm shift, and it requires people becoming heart-centered and really looking at other people as, human, and seeing that intrinsic value of them as their humanity rather than a product of consumption for their hyper-individual desires, right? There's lots of things that we want to do that the law says, no, you can't do that, because when we weigh it against the collective good of society, this is detrimental. And, people always talk, oh, my rights, it's all about charter rights. But when you look at section 1 of the charter, it says all of these things are weighed, when looking at the inherent dignity of the human being and the social push for dignity and equality and, gender equality especially.
If you had to choose between really effective legislation and budgets and, synergy between law enforcement, et cetera, or just like appealing to people's hearts? What do you think is more powerful?
I think appealing to people's hearts is more powerful. And I think that's why I'm such a strong proponent of the John School, because it's a very low cost program. The men pay the equivalent of a fine. So they pay $1,000 fine. That goes to CEASE, the Center to Empower All Survivors of Exploitation. We put on this 8-hour program, and all of that money goes into supporting women. So bursaries, paying off rent if they're in arrears, whatever they might need, just something that is going to help them move along through that journey. So it's really a reinvestment into community that these men are doing when they have taken for so long, right? For their own personal gain. And I want an orgasm on demand, and I live in capitalism, so I've got the money, and here's someone who doesn't, so now I can have that. Is that really ethical? And people say, oh, get your morals out of it. But all law is rooted in morals, right? We don't kill people because it's wrong to kill people. We don't abuse children because it's wrong to abuse children. There has to be that moral lens applied to it, I think. And if not, then we've totally lost our humanity.
Jordan actually quotes John Maynard Keynes in the live chat, says, capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone, which is a great quote. Christian says, Andrea, I respect you deeply, is very grateful for this conversation, says this is an important discussion, and I thank you for having it. Kimberly says people know about all this, but they just turn their eyes away. Yeah, I mean, it's. Mark says, shame on anybody who might attack Andrea for her incredible advocacy of this caliber. I understand why it's controversial, though. Right? Like a lot of people sort of, this is, you don't see. Like it's, let me just say, it's more, and maybe you could cite examples to the contrary, but it's you're more likely to see examples in the Western world anyway of governments loosening restrictions on things as opposed to tightening them.
Yeah,
right?
that's
like
neoliberalism, right? Market-oriented policies.
It's true.
Encroaching on the state.
Know? So if you look at, in Canada with whether it's cannabis or now there's talk about decriminalizing all drugs. I mean, that's one area. We could talk about a million of them. You look at gambling laws, and like those are being loosened. Gambling access is more of a priority now than less. And I'd be curious to see if if advocates like you or others could convince government that this is the step to take in a clamping down direction, because it seems to me to be like you may not be able to find thousands of people that'll publicly call for loosening restrictions on the sex trade.
Yeah.
Like some guy that's like, the CEO of his company, and he's going to go take a stand and say they need to loosen. It's not going to happen for obvious reasons. But if you look at, you telling us about your experience and your critics, I'd be curious to know do you have any polling or understanding on where the public is on this? And
it's very divided. Yeah. Again, it's, they've done some studies and it's kind of 50-50, but I think a lot of that is ignorance, right? People they just don't understand. And it took me years. Like I've now been fully submerged in this topic for 18 years. And, it took me until probably, I want to say about 4 years ago, until I finally felt like, okay, I've got a firm grasp of understanding the many nuances to this topic, because it's like the abortion debate, right? It's just one of those things that is so complex, and everybody's experience with it is so different. So everybody thinks that their experience is the be all end all, and that should be what people go off of. And I think that in one way that has been my strength is that I'm a defector of sex work ideology. I'm not, some Puritan that has just come out of the woodwork and been like, this is wrong, stop doing this. It's because I actually believed one thing, and then I saw, the social influence upon young women that were impressionable and impoverished. And then, I could see the fallacies that existed with that. And then I had this new introduction of, genuine empowerment and hearing these narratives and saying, wow, okay, like that's actually what it is. So I think once you've kind of been on both sides, you can understand. And I want to say, I don't fault anybody who's in the industry. I don't shame women. I don't think like, bad you're a fallen woman or anything like that. Like, I think that they are, captured. They are ideologically captured, like many of us are, right? Men and women who are involved in this. And when people actually remove themselves out of the sex industry, they always say the same thing to me. One, I had no idea, and two, my life is so much better now. Like all my other engagements and encounters with people have kind of become decommercialized. I've started working on that human level rather than on that like hyper individualized capitalist mindset level.
Alberta Girl was in the chat, and she was just wondering how you found your way out, how you were able to get out. We hear, I'm not drawing a direct line, but you hear people that like try to get out of gangs, and oftentimes they pay for it with their life. Was for you a matter of like, I'm not doing this anymore and I'm walking out, or was it more complicated than that?
I wanted it to be that, and I know you know this, and many people listening probably don't, but whenever I was 25, I had been in prostitution for 3 years, and I had operated out of just as many brothels, 3 brothels, and I was mistreated so badly in all of those brothels, oftentimes by female owners. And in my mindset, it was, okay, it's a safety thing, right? It's because I don't own the brothel and I'm not in charge of my own self. I have to stay with this man, or this owner is going to fine me for rejecting him because they've lost a room rental fee. So at 25, I was, still fairly broke, had just kind of cleared my debt. And then I put myself very deep in debt, about $100,000 in debt. And I built a City of Edmonton licensed brothel at 25 years old. And it wasn't with any intention of exploiting women or making money off of them or anything like that. It was just a little 2-room brothel. But I wanted my own legal facility in which I could operate out of, that I wasn't under the control or direction of others. And in my mindset, I thought, well, I'm going to help women, right? I'm going to make this place that's actually going to be all these things that we've heard it is in Pretty Woman and, all this narrative. And I very quickly realized that wasn't the case. So for me, I was trapped in a commercial lease. When I actually did want to leave, it took me over 2 years before I was actually able to exit, because I had this $80,000 lease. And had I broke that lease, I would have, had to go pay that back. How? Operating back in other brothels for other women. So 4 years I owned that brothel. 18 months approximately I rented rooms to other women who were my friends in the industry. And I've, spoken with almost all of them that I can get in touch with. And I've said, like, I'm so sorry. Like, I thought I was helping you. I wasn't helping you. I was just moving the abuse that you experienced with me at a different brothel to my brothel.
What did they say?
All of them that I've spoken to have said, like, you didn't know, and
Are they still in the industry?
No, most of them have exited now. Many of them are married. They have children and families. All of them are in trauma therapy, trying to work through it. And they still say, like, all these years later, it still damages me. But I'm very grateful that, they don't hold anything against me, because that's something that I've never forgiven myself for. And I don't know if I ever will, because, that brothel still exists in Edmonton. It's still an active licensed brothel. And there's still women being harmed in that place. And really, in my mind, I left a stain on the city. Like, there's something there now because of me that is added to this. So, if I ever win the lottery, the very first thing I'm doing, Ryan, is going and buying that brothel, and I'm shutting it down, and I'm turning it into an in-call site for women, in prostitution to drop in to get resources and peer support and information and stuff like that. So, but yeah, it was a 2-year process of me saying, okay, I'm ready. I want to leave, until I actually could leave, because, we embed our lives so deeply into this industry, and our identity is so tied to that too. So you have to really build a new identity. And of course you have to build a new way of surviving, a new economic means of survival. So it was really hard, because, when you've spent 7 years in prostitution, you'd be surprised at how few people want to hire you. They really don't see you as human. They see you as, trash that came off of the corner, and they're just like, oh, I actually got fired from a government job, and I can't even say anything in full because I'm legally gagged by the government.
Right.
But, I had a man in his 70s who I was well qualified for the job. I placed higher than all the other people that were in competition with the job with me. And he found out that I used to sell sex, and he said, we don't want a prostitute working for us. And he fired me, and I was 7 months pregnant at the time with my first child. So, it was very hard to transition back into the conventional workforce. And even when you do that, you feel like you don't belong. Like, I just felt like I had this like scarlet A on my forehead that everybody knew. And, and living that double life was very hard. So I think that was also something that really pushed me to come out publicly and say, no one's going to hold this over me anymore. I'm going to own this. I'm going to talk about it, and hopefully it helps somebody. But it won't be this shadow that follows me anymore.
Well, it's amazing that you can, and can I just say, and I told you this before, but like, to show up and just like talk about this, and it's never lost on me when I'm talking to somebody. It's not just about working in the sex trade or anything. It could be a million different contexts. But when you're talking to somebody, Spencer Beach sat in the same chair as you a couple of months ago, and Spencer was on a construction job and was horrifically burned, miraculously survived, has never been the same, not even close. But he's one of the most compelling and impressive people. I'm going to get emotional talking about him. And he sat here and talked about how if he could change everything that day, he wouldn't, because of how his life has gone since then. But I recognize when I'm asking him or you or somebody else, take us back to that day when the explosion happened and your body was horrifically burned, that you're asking people to relive trauma. Yeah. And it takes a great deal of, whether or not somebody agrees with your perspective on this, they can't claim that they know more about it than you. And it takes a great deal of courage for you to talk about it. You've gotten this audience and me thinking, which I'm very grateful for, and you're doing really incredible work. But I want to recognize that, like, for me, let me ask you a question that's been banging around in my brain. I decided not to ask you, but because you just said this, I want to ask you, do you envision getting to, like, how important is the so-called credibility that comes with lived experience? At some point, would you prefer that when Ryan Jespersen is tweeting about you're coming on the show, that the 3 things he says, author, filmmaker, that the 3rd is not former sex seller? Like, at what point will your bio no longer include that? Or is that something that it's important to include, do you think?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I've never been asked that. And I don't know if I've ever examined that, because, of course, it's sometimes well received when you're with people who are heart-centered and open-minded and want to learn more about this issue and aren't completely captured by sex work ideology. Or, it's very shamed, right? And like I said, people just look at you as nothing, and you'll never be accepted into anywhere, right? Like, you'll meet somebody's, as a mom, I'll meet somebody's, another mom's husband, and I'm always wondering, like, does she think I'm going to try to steal her man? And
Sure.
It's just all these things where it just creates self-doubt in you and really attacks your self-worth.
Still?
Yeah, still sometimes, and that's, 11 years now that I've been out. So it still lingers there because, again, it was 7 years of that messaging of this is who you are. This is what you are meant to do. This is all that you can do and all that you are good for. So it's hard to really shake those things, especially whenever those are put into you at a younger age as well, right? When you don't know better and you're not as worldly. But I think I always probably will keep it in my bio because I do think it is important. And, it's kind of interesting because people will say, well, listen to sex workers. And of course, everybody should have the opportunity to be heard wherever they sit on this continuum. But I do find that when people say listen to sex workers, they're not talking about people like me. They're talking about those that are pushing the narrative that makes people money off of the backs of other people, right? So it's tricky. I do want people to understand that there is a personal investment from me in this, but it's not all that it is. That's actually probably the smaller part now. And I've had enough time in this realm to see the bigger picture.
I agree. Alberta Girl, by the way, followed up as you were talking about the brothel that you opened. And if you win the lottery, you want to go back. And Alberta Girl says Andrea needs to forgive herself because without that brothel, she might not have found a way out or been able to provide a way out for any of the women that she worked with who may have found an exit. So there's another perspective on that for you.
You're very lovely.
Yeah. Can I ask, you were last with us on the show on January 5th of 2021, and people can search that interview. Just look for Real Talk, Ryan Jespersen, Andrea Heinz. But I understand that somebody reached out to you. Can I ask you about this?
Yes.
I guess I am asking you about
it. Yeah, this was, and this is really a testament to you, Ryan, in platforming this perspective, because again, this is a position that is just not platformed as much as the palatable narrative of sex work ideology, but this was really powerful. So I've been on Twitter, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, since June of 2020. And, periodically people would reach out to me, hey, I'm a former sex buyer, this and that, thanks for sharing your story. And I see it differently now. So one day, I think it was only about a day or two after you and I were on here, I got a DM, a direct message from a man. And it was somebody who actually purchased sex from me for about 2 or 3 years, maybe a little bit longer. And he said, I just saw you on Ryan Jespersen's show. And it was just mind blowing. I had no clue. I always thought that you were this person that I knew, right? That you had presented yourself as this really empowered, really happy, sexually liberated woman, all about prostitution, all about the industry. And he said, I just saw this totally different side. And he said, now I've stumbled across your Twitter and I'm reading some of these things and I realized none of that was actually who you genuinely are. And he said, so, I've stopped purchasing sex. I've started, a relationship now. I'm trying to kind of move away from this and it's going really good. And I just don't want to be a part of that anymore. And thank you for, talking out about it because I'm sure it's not easy. So I honor you. I honor you for the work that you do in giving voice to this because that's real change right there, right? That was one mind that was changed. And it really meant a lot to me because it was a man that had paid me for sex. Yeah.
It's huge. That's as big as it gets, right?
Yeah. And I want to talk to those men, right? I want to talk to every man who has ever paid me for sex. I'm not angry at any of them. Some of them were a-holes to say the least. They were not nice people, but most of them were. And I sold them a lie, and I lied to them to separate them from their money that I needed. So, I feel like I exploited those men in return. And I do think the industry is duly exploitative in that way. So, it was just a really beautiful moment. And so I'm grateful for you for
I don't know what role we had to play in it. I think it's remarkable that you come on and talk about it. And a shout out to that guy for reaching out. He didn't have to do that. But I imagine he's probably working through his own stuff too. And maybe it was cathartic to reach out, but to revisit it, it's a testament to the power of the work that you're doing. And again, I'm just grateful that you're here to talk about it so openly, keep it so real, and get so many people thinking about this. I'm grateful for you, Andrea, and thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm grateful for you, Ryan.
Yeah,
glad
Andrea Heinz, I'm glad we are as well. Andrea Heinz, by the way, great Twitter handle. You deserve it. So it's Heinz is H-E-I-N-Z. Your mom wants us to point out there's no T in Heinz, but H-E-I-N-Z. So Hindsight 2020, which is a really, really good Twitter handle. Nice job there. We'll put it in the show notes so people can find you if they want to follow up and maybe send you a note as well. I know you're open to that.
Yeah.
And again, you can find Andrea's book online at whenmenbuysex.ca. The title, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays. You can buy the book there or find it in your favorite bookstore. And let us know how you feel about this. I guarantee this is going to prompt some emails. Talk at ryanjespersen.com is where you can find us, and we'll leave some time on tomorrow's show to get into this. We'll be back to talking about politics and the regular news cycle and all that, but we'll leave some time for your responses to what you heard today from Andrea Heinz. As we wrap, I want to put a couple of things on your radar. Number one, the 22nd of March, that's this Friday, is World Water Day. Ahead of that, on Thursday, that's March 21st, we're going to present a World Water Real Talk Roundtable. Then we're talking politics on the Friday. We're going to get into what's happening in our home province of Alberta with our friends from Alberta municipalities. In the meantime, thanks for sharing this content. Thanks for hitting subscribe. We'll talk to you again soon.
Real Talk is hosted by Ryan Jespersen. Executive producer Josh Dunford.